Hello everybody, it's been a long time since the last book review and there's a reason for that. This tome dropped onto my table and I thought, right, I have to suspend all my other reading now. It's called Medieval Philosophy and it's by Mr Adamson. Now, this is part of a series called History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I read the classical philosophy one, and having read this, I now have to read the Indian philosophy and the Arabian philosophy volumes. This particular volume takes us from slightly before the millennium to set the scene and takes us as far as the end of the 14th century. And as the title will tell you, Philosophy Without Any Gaps will explain that the Renaissance already had the seeds sown at the end of the 14th century and even earlier. And of course the philosophy which is carried forward in this book had its seeds planted before. As indeed in this scholastic period Aristotle was clung to as the philosopher with capital letters. Thinking was often a way of showing that Aristotle was right. There was no concept of scientific experiment. We see these ideas beginning to flourish at this time. What can I say about it? It was brilliant. It seemed to have been written exactly for me, i.e. somebody who's interested in philosophy. And I have to say, studying philosophy, we didn't dip our toe into medieval philosophy, perhaps a tiny bit of Thomas Aquinas, but it seemed to start with Descartes in Western universities. So this is a great opportunity to fill those gaps. And in the nature of these things that so delight me, they shine lights onto corners that I had no idea existed. So we begin with the remarkable Alcuin of York, Eriugena, Peter Damian, and other big hitters of the time, like St Anselm, who is credited with being the first to put forward a philosophical proof of God. But as Mr Adamson stresses, this is not an attempt to show that God can be proved in a logical sense. It's meant to uphold the already Christian belief that we take as given. And that is one reason why this is a good book. Everything is in context. Now, the reason I'm attracted to medieval philosophy, despite being an atheist, is that I'm interested in the history of human thought, and taken as such, this is a magnificent book. This explains clearly how people tried to reason with, and this is an idea from Mr Adamson himself, with the idea that, as he put it, you've arrived late at the lecture where they already decided that God exists, God created the world. Hang on, or did he? Maybe it was eternal. The mysteries of the Trinity, the mysteries of the Eucharist. How can Jesus Christ be a piece of holy wafer? Is it literal? What exactly? And of course all these questions have been debated for centuries before by Christians. But as I say, take it for granted. There is a God. There is life after death, and one might say there is such thing as good and evil as well. We have to get into this mindset if we are to understand these people, and that's the job that this book does so brilliantly. Almost 550 nice large pages with small text, so you can take your time over them and reread them, as I did many a time. I still haven't got my head around it. I'll have to read it again. But we find the stories of Peter Damian, William of Champeaux, Adelard of Bath, Gerard of Cremona. Now, these names won't be familiar to you, but they all played their part. The hot topics, apart from the religious themes, and this is where the philosophy begins to emerge from these theological conflicts, is about, for example, the Platonic idea of forms. And this is something which exercises us today. We're still not quite sure, are we? I mean, the nominalists, such as Occam and Buridan, say, well, this is nonsense, that a book is a book, and that's all there is. There isn't a form of a book, for example. There isn't a thing. And if there is, where is it? Well, the answers to the objections to both sides of this hot topic lead us into the various divergent strands of philosophy. We also have to try to figure out whether God willed everything. He already knows, doesn't he? Who's going to be saved and who isn't, so it hardly matters, does it, what you do on this earth? Or, flip side of that, as Augustine believed, and if I remember right, this is the Pelagian heresy, that all the people that lived before Jesus Christ had no chance of getting baptised or any of true Christian glory. Well, they could be as good as they liked, but they would never be saved. Duns Scotus, Meister Eckhart, who of course was more of a mystic than a philosopher. And then we get Chaucer, Jean Gerson of the Romance of the Rose and the Querelle de la Rose, and Dante making important contributions to philosophy. There are the Oxford calculators, who I've read about many times, as they crop up in, obviously, the history of mathematics. The people who one day thought, well, I don't know, it seemed a bit stupid measuring redness or hotness, but maybe you can attach numerical scales to these things and measure them and then bring them into the fold of scientific inquiry. I can't really even summarise this book. There's a chapter about angels. Angels, very important. Nicholas of Hautecort, one of my favourite, well, I mean, I think everybody's favourite French 14th century philosopher. He makes an appearance explaining why you had to be very careful whether you thought God could only create this world as it is, or there was a possibility of another world where the angles of a triangle don't add up to 180 degrees, for example. And this, along with the list of Paris do's and don'ts for the University 1270, where you weren't allowed to teach certain things, and it was very clearly set out why they were or were not heretical. A large, long, complicated list that reminds me of nothing so much as now we relive history all the time. Any historian will tell you. And here we are, instead of dividing along the lines of Catholics and Protestants, or Muslims and Jews, or nominalists and realists, or Neoplatonists or Augustinians. We have our own differences which seem to split the world into two along many different vectors. I'm going to be picky now and say, all right, I've got one little consideration. In among all the brilliant arguments, we are presented with quite a lot of women philosophers who I don't deny deserve their place in this book, but it's quite surprising to find out how many influential women there were at those times, especially secular. I would like to take issue with Mr Adamson saying that if he had to choose three of the most influential philosophers in this period, he would choose Abelard and Eloise and Hildegard of Bingen. So that's 2 out of 3 women. But I'm not entirely sure if Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, who Adamson says is a little bit over-egged in the history of the world due to his attachment to scholasticism and his subsequent influence. But I would say, you can, come on, Abelard, Eloise, it's all a matter of personal opinion. But I think there's a little sop to feminism there. And so along the same lines we get, not exact quotes, but ideas by the medieval scholastics put forward in abstract terms with she instead of he as the chosen pronoun to mean any person. I'm all in favour of this. I do it myself when I'm writing. I say, well, we've used he to represent people for so long, let's use she, and it's very, very common these days. But it does seem a little strange to be reading John Buridan's opinions of something and using this same modern idea. I would have left it, that's all I'm saying. And if people need a little note at the beginning of books explaining that the word he was not considered offensive in the past, Well, we'll just put a little note in, then everybody will be happy. But those are minor quibbles on what has been one of my great reading treats of the latest years. So if you want to catch up with Catherine of Siena, Giles of Rome, Peter Olivi, oh, and I should say this all feeds into the Arabic philosophers who preserve the texts of Aristotle and especially Plato, and so you get a lot of influence from Avicenna and Averroes, which I'm hoping to read about in the book about Arabian philosophy. So there's plenty more to read. I don't know how this guy's going to do it. He's got to the 14th century, well, just coming into the 15th century maybe, and well, there's still a long way to go. I hope he lives forever so that he can complete the series, because I want to know what he's got to say about Heidegger, Wittgenstein and Zizek.